Good afternoon. We're live for this e-Memoir session. We're looking at an update on the funding of 16 to 19 study programmes for 2020 to 2021. And we're also going to be taking into consideration some of the updates surrounding COVID also. Sessions will be led by Beej Kaczmarczyk, the e-Memoir. And as ever, we like to keep these webinars as interactive as possible. So feel free to use a question or chat facility at any point throughout the duration of this webinar, so you don't have to wait until the end. If you're watching this on a video recording, you also have questions or thoughts, then our contact details will be available on the final slide, and I'd encourage you to get in touch with us. I'd also encourage you to share the video recording and the slides with your colleagues as well. And if there's anything you'd like to see us cover in future webinars, anything that perhaps comes out of this one that just makes you think and that we might be able to help you with, then again, get in touch and I'm sure we'll be able to include it in upcoming webinars. So without further ado, I'm going to mute my microphone and I'll hand over to Beej. Thanks, Beej.
Thanks very much, Manik, and good afternoon to everyone, and hopefully you're all keeping well and safe. As Manik says, this will be a sort of, if you want, a reflection on what we already know about the changes in funding for 2020 to 21. And obviously looking forward to 2021 to 22, because obviously a lot of the factors would determine funding in 21 to 22 will be affected by what's happened this year. And we've had notification from the ESFA about how they're going to treat some of the factors and elements of the funding formula. And I'll do that in the course of this afternoon. But also I think as the chair of a medium-sized college and also director of two private training companies with significant numbers of 16 to 19 students, some of whom were directly funded for, others which were a subcontractor to FE colleges, is I think some of the impacts that the COVID-19 crisis is having on the current learners, particularly on retention and also in the carry over learners that will go into next year. Some of them to obviously complete the second year of a 2-year program. Some will be completing some elements of this year's program because they're having breaks in learning for all kinds of reasons. And obviously it's also affected by what's happening to our 16 to 19 apprentices, but that's not going to be touched on as much today, since the focus is very much about study programs. Now, what we did have as the, if you want, the sort of headlines before we before the lockdown in March, we knew that there would be a significant investment, and this was well deserved and well needed, perhaps not as much as some of us thought we needed, but certainly in terms of this year, another £400 million was being put in. And we'll look at some of the impacts of that, taking account of what's happened in the last few weeks. We were going to retain the basic funding methodology, particularly the lag number effect, which is so critical for determining our funding for the year, the coming year. And we know that after much lobbying and canvassing, the final increase in the basic rates of funding for 16, 17 and 8-year-olds funded by study programs went up by just over 4%. And that was almost half of that £400 million. But we can also see that £120 million, and that was in that headline at the top right hand corner, was being put in to support the basic and intrinsic cost of some of the more expensive high value subjects: engineering, construction, catering, etc., as well as science. We were going to receive additional funding for maths and English for all those learners doing level 3 programs, which is extending what was already agreed for T levels would be for other study program learners. We knew that the funding tolerance in terms of the English and maths condition would be maintained, no change there. Little bit of money in to retain our teachers and leaders and to attract new people in, to particularly to the delivery of some of the higher technical subjects, the T levels. But one thing perhaps to note that was already in some areas, maybe in your area it's already happened, in other areas it's certainly a flattening, in other areas it's still not happened, is that there would be some impacts of demography. So that in some parts of the country, the number of learners actually leaving year 11 is expected to increase. And that would obviously have an impact, not necessarily on this year's funding, but obviously on funding in future years, and that would be through the lag number effect. Other parts of the country, that isn't yet becoming apparent. So that was the sort of, if you want, before COVID. And then obviously with COVID, with the shutdown from the end of March, with many of your study program students now having to study from home, to not be attending your college or your training centre, other than maybe those who might be vulnerable learners, those learners who are the children of key workers. And obviously, we've also got learners with high needs who we're the only, if you want, carer that's available to them. And that means in some cases your institutions have stayed open, but generally it means that the large number of learners you would have expected are not there. Now, obviously, that could have carried significant financial implications for any type of business, any type of institution, which is dependent on funding. In our case, because a large proportion of our funding is coming from the ESFA as grant funding, the decision was made fairly early on, and this gave us reassurance that the ESFA would continue to fund those of you who are grant funded for the remainder of this year, according to your scheduled monthly profile payments. And that would also mean that any of next year's allocations, in terms of 2020 to 21, were also being confirmed based on that national profile. So that's a great amount of financial assurance, which grant-funded providers of study program, less so for those of you that might have a direct contract with the ESFA to deliver 16 to 19, but it was also quite important because this gave reassurance to those of you, including myself, that any subcontracting arrangements to deliver 16 to 19 study programs would also be assumed to be honoured and payments made accordingly. Now, there is one exception to this important decision, and that is that if in the mid-year you'd already indicated to the ESFA that there was any significant falls in your numbers of learners, that would not be, and this was more appropriate, obviously, with those of you who are funded through the AB, is that you would obviously maybe ask for that to be reprofiled. Now, I know that some providers of study programs have been in those exceptional circumstances where, for whatever reason, they've had to make some significant changes to the number of learners. But generally, I think we were being assured that as grant-funded providers, certainly we would be okay for the remainder of this year. Now, of course, that comes with certain conditions, and the COVID-19 conditions are quite significant, because even though you're assured, there are implications for you that you've got to be seen to be doing these things. So you've got to have a business continuity model that says, wherever possible, and certainly on study programs, we will be employing the relevant staff, those staff who are predominantly involved in the delivery of study programs to 16 to 19 on the current contracts, and it would not be furloughing them. Now, you have got some situations where staff are teaching in study programs, maybe in what do you call it, apprenticeships, and also on adult education funded programs, where you might have had to furlough the full member of a staff, or on a part-time basis. By the way, there is an expectation that from June, sometime in June, some of your furloughed staff might be brought back for a proportion of their timetables to deliver part-time, and therefore your claim from the furlough will be less. But the general expectation, and I know that some of you listening in are tertiary and sixth form colleges, is that the staff would continue to be employed that were directly involved in the delivery of study programs, but also any non-teaching staff who are directly involved in the delivery of either financial support, data, student services, etc. as well. So it covered both teaching and non-teaching staff. Now, the assumption would be that you would continue to support those current learners to completion of the programs unless it was impossible for them to do it. So some learners might have had to take a break in learning. partly maybe because they might have been ill themselves, and it's therefore difficult for them to continue the program. They will therefore be continuing after the end of this academic year. That will have to be taken account of in your retention data as well, and I'll come back to that. But also that you're expected to make provision for the children of key workers and vulnerable young people, which I know many of you have, and that's been really a good test of how we could cope with things like social distancing, smaller groups, etc., etc. But I think the key thing here was, and I'm sure you've all reported relative success on this, and that is that we were expecting that our study program students, whether it be first year or second year, and obviously there are going to be differences and changes now to the assessment arrangements, which has been the subject of other webinars, is that they would continue the programs and there would be a variety of teaching, learning and assessment methods available. And one of the, I suppose, the questions that's being posed is that, with the current funding and the availability of that funding, has that been enough to cover the cost, additional costs, for example, of introducing much more e-learning, online tutoring, one-to-one mentoring, webinars and other forms of e-learning? But I think the assumption would be that whatever, if we couldn't deliver face-to-face, that would be the main aspect of delivery. And that would, in some cases, mean, and I know this is very rare, but if you had unspent bursary fund, which was for the 16 to 19-year-olds, you could actually direct some of that, and I don't think it was I don't think it's news to you because this was an early indication from the ESFA, so that you could actually, in some cases, pay for equipment for some of those learners who might not have access at home to things like laptops and the Wi-Fi that might be needed. By the way, that would be an expectation out of any unspent bursary fund that you might have, because other uses of it might not be the case. If you find that your unspent bursary fund was negligible or not enough, then you could make a business case for additional funding. And there's guidance on that in the latest, if you want, from the ESFA on how to maintain your business sustainability and continuation of service. But there's two other things perhaps to note, that any learners who needed additional learning support you still have to evidence that you would be trying to provide for them with, for example, online mentoring, work with the partners that might be needed to visit. I know that some of you have been doing home visits at a distance. I think that, that's appreciated, including obviously what provision you might make for high needs students. One thing, by the way, there is a separate section in the SFA guidance on high needs students. Because you're getting the high needs funding based on the numbers of learners that you had last year, funded at £6,000, the expectation is that gives you continuity. The other expectation is that the local authorities will continue to pay top-up funding to you. And I know that some of them have asked for evidence how you've supported high needs students. We know that's in one case as applied to us. But as long as you can show that, it's a one-to-one mentoring, or there's the use of specialized adaptive technologies, etc., I think you'll be okay. The one area that we had most difficulty was in those 16 to 19 in receipt of learner support funding. Things like, for example, free meals, those that had under the age of 20 with childcare needs, and some of our learners who are in care or coming out of care, was to make sure that they got access to things like free meals. And we've done that through a mixture of vouchers and other means. There have been obviously some problems with that. And I know some of you have had to resort to paying some cash to those learners and their families. So those are all, if you want, COVID-19 implications of being given the reassurance of that funding for the current year. Now, in terms of any of the outcomes of that, in terms of the learners that need to continue into next year, those that have got out of the learning habit, I think that's something that's going to have to be reviewed on a frequent basis by yourselves particularly if you do reopen in June and July, to see how that works. But also, I think in terms of how to assess those learners. And I know you've got those short assessment windows, but we, for example, have had to bring back will be bringing back some of our learners who do need to complete some observed assessments to get the license to practice and to complete their full level 3 diplomas. So I know that's another set of issues that you've had on the delivery of the curriculum. So are there any questions on if you want the COVID-19 support and the implications for you as providers of study programs? Any other comments or any anxieties that you've raised about how you've provided, for example, the evidence of your support for learners? And we've been using things like OneFile, and I'm sure you've got other means to do that. What I think has been quite well received is the quality of some of that support and the quality of some of the materials that our staff have produced. So yeah, we've got a couple of comments there about we've done the same. We're really pleased with the outcomes for our students in terms of the support they've had, hard work from the staff, and I think that's commendable. And I think generally the feeling is that a lot of the learners have been quite adaptive and resilient, but there have been obviously some concerns, and my biggest concern is what I call the left behind students, the ones that maybe didn't have access to study time, places to study, such as in their house, access to equipment, weren't good learners remotely. What are we going to do to catch up with and to help them? And I think that's one of our first priorities. I know in June we're going to have a schedule, a gradual opening. One of the first groups that we're going to call in are going to be those that have been most left behind, that have really struggled with this last few months. Now, to return to what was originally being allocated to the sector, I think one of the things that's become clear is that there was some additional investment in other aspects of what we were doing in terms of study programs. For those of you, for example, that were developing more and more industry placements for next year for your study program or for T-levels, the capacity development fund, the CDF that you had, obviously the big issue that we're going to have with that is, well, are there going to be the placements available? With that 2-month disruption, what's happened to your engagement with employers? What's happened to your planning for next year in terms of making adequate provision for that? And I'll pick through some of those. The other thing that was certainly going to continue for another year was the advanced maths premium. So you know that you get £600 for each additional level 3 maths learner that's doing one of the recognized qualifications on top of what your baseline figures were. So that is still there, and that's obviously to encourage the promotion of doing those level 3 maths programs. The key thing that was going to be different for us, and that's not only for those of you delivering T-levels, but those who are delivering study programs predominantly, is the level 3 maths and English payment, which I'll look at, which is going to be applied to all of your level 3 learners on substantive programs. The T-level Early Adopter Development Fund, which was going to be paid in 2020 to 21, was there to support those of you who were going to be early adopters of the new T-levels, the next cohort of T-levels, to deliver them, or of course if you were going to be doing it for the first time in 2021. Now you can see that quite a lot of that investment is now going to be, well, are we going to be able to actually take advantage of that investment when we've got issues about the introduction of T-levels and some delay in that? Clearly, we've lost 2 months of at least 2 months of development time, but also the difficulty in finding enough placements. And those placements, by the way, are not just for T-levels, because those of you delivering study programs have also been trying to get, obviously, placements for your study programs. So if we look at the actual funding formula itself, this is the funding formula that was going to be used in 2021. We can see the new elements there, the level 3 English and maths payment. We can also see something I will talk about, the high value courses premium, which was coming out of that 120 million additional funding. But you can see now that the big issues, and I've marked them with these question marks, what's going to happen to the number of learners, particularly are you going to expect the same number to come back from year 1 to year 2? What about the continuing year 1 that might need some more time next year? What about those that might not be attracted to you for all kinds of reasons, because we're not be able to do things like open days and open nights, etc. But also what's going to happen in terms of, could there be a massive influx of full-time 16 to 19 learners because there are less opportunities for them to do things like apprenticeships? So that's doubtful. The funding rates we know about. The retention factor needs to be picked up. The level 3 program maths and English payment, because that's based on prior attainment. What's going to happen in terms of prior attainment? We're not using the external assessments. We're using another model, alternative assessments for things like functional skills and GCSEs. Disadvantage funding, block 2. Remember, block 1 is postal code. Block 2 is prior attainment English and maths. That's obviously going to be affected. The condition of funding adjustment, what's going to happen in terms of those people who are going to be doing repeats of English and maths programs. We'll talk a wee bit about the high value courses premium, but to then look at the aspects which are not directly related to program delivery, we've got issues about the capacity and delivery fund. Where are we going to find these new placements from? And obviously big issues around student support funding, particularly post COVID, in terms of what might be needed significantly to support lots of learners who otherwise might find it difficult to participate. So you can see that the formula itself, although it doesn't change significantly, there will be aspects of it we've got to reflect. Now, the actual funding rates for next year are already defined. That's for study programs. So that's not T levels. And of course, clearly, I will talk about some of the learners who are part-time next year, because the chances are, if a learner has had, say, a planned end date, the actual end date was before the end of this year because they've had to have a break in learning, and then you restart them next year, they'll be part-time over the course of 2 years. Part-time in 1 year, part-time in the other. Now that impacts on the rates that we're going to use through the lag number formula, the lag number adjustments that have to be made for 21-22. So you can see that although the funding rates are well, and they show that 4.7% increase, would it be enough to, for example, deal with some of the additional costs that are likely to be there without COVID-19, as well as what might be required after COVID-19? We know that for T levels, and I know some of you are planning to offer T levels, that would have added 4 bands. The reason the bands are bigger because there's more hours that's going to be delivered for each T level. And of course, in addition to what's in the T level, there's also additional funding for the industry placements of £550 over 2 years. There's also additional funding for the English and maths payment for level 3 programs. Now, remember, that additional money for industry placement is not available to study program learners who have to find the cost of you as providers have to find the cost of their study program inside the funding band there, rather than in addition, which is the case with T levels. We've rehearsed all the issues about T levels being longer, requiring obviously a much greater element of industrial placement, and that's reflected. But the one key difference here between the study program funding and the funding for T levels is that 18-year-olds on T levels are funded at the same rate as 16 and 17-year-olds, rather than at a lower rate, as applies, as you can see from the previous table here, for learners who are on study programs where the rate of funding goes down to band 4A. So that's a difference that we've picked up before. Also to note that any T-level student who starts with you next August, September, they'll be funded at £650 for English and £650 for maths, based on prior attainment if they haven't achieved at least a grade 4 to 9 on their GCSEs under block 2 funding. So that's also reflective of that you're going to have a longer period of time that they will spend in contact with you over the course of each one of their 2 years. We've already talked about the one-off payments for early adopters, and I think that that is still expected to be the case for next year. So those are the T-level bands. Most of the first T-levels so far are appearing in either band 6 or 7. I can't expect to see many in band 9, because I think that's quite a significant number of programs that you can see delivering £12,000 without the money for the level 3 English or the work placement. So those are the sort of funding rates that we're going to be used next year. The other changes were relating to program cost weightings, and we know that because of the evidence there, that there was a concern that things like science, engineering, construction, and catering weren't being reflected enough. Their intrinsic costs per hour not being reflected enough in the program cost weightings. So they were going to be increased. Some of them were going to be increased in, it was in 6 subject areas, by 10 percentage points. 2 new ones would be introduced, a low, 1.1, and a very high at 1.4. So things like transportation, building and construction, hospitality and catering would increase from 1.2 to 1.3. Engineering manufacturing would go from high to very high. That means that some subjects will still stay in high, 1.3, whereas others like manufacturing engineering will go up to 1.4. Good news for those of you delivering A-level sciences or vocational sciences, the sciences which were previously weighted at 1 will now be weighted at 1.1. And that's the sort of rationale behind it. Now, what it immediately started to create for some of you planning study programs for next year was, well, how would they be reflected in things like, for example, working out which departments broke even, which subject areas were covering the whole of their costs, where a large element of that cost would be reflected in things like double staffing, the use of technicians and workshop assistants. But it only covered those 6 subject areas there. And those are the new, and that, I think that to some extent internally already changed some of our costing. Certainly in our case, it meant that some areas such as catering, instead of having to recruit 15 or 16 students to break even, the number would now be 14 or 15. So a marginal difference there, which obviously meant that those departments could break even now at a more favourable rate. So those are the new program cost weightings, and they will obviously apply, and that will be part of that extra funding that's provided. The second block of the extra funding for the high cost, high value subjects is this new element, which is called the high values course premium. And that's obviously to encourage the delivery of selected level 3 programs, which do relate to what was obviously an industrial strategy. Now, you can see, if anything, there's become more need for these. If after the COVID-19 crisis, the country has to rethink its industrial strategy and have a greater investment in things like engineering and manufacturing, this might actually be a boost to you to start thinking about delivering more of those subjects at level 3 inside study programs. And what is clear is that this premium is only available for level 3. And obviously that raises an issue, but what about level 2 vocational and technical subjects? No, it's only level 3. And it does include T levels. It also extends to certain categories of A levels, but the learner would have to do at least 2 of the 3 A levels in that list that I'll show you in a minute. This premium, by the way, is payable at the rate of £400 per student per year that they're on their study program. So again, over 2 years, £800. Now, the list of qualifications that this applies to is now available, and it's obviously worth having a look, but obviously you've modeled that already into next year's plans. One thing about this is that the ESFA will be very keen to monitor whether you skew any of your activities, such as enrollment, guidance, etc., to say to these students, if you're thinking of doing the arts, don't do things like that bring us this premium, is that also is what impact it does have on where there are significant gaps and shortages in high skilled areas. And that obviously might become more apparent when you get more information about where the government might have to make major investments in technical learning, technical training post-COVID, particularly for 16 to 19, but also for adults. So here's the subjects in terms of A levels. The learner's going to be doing 2 out of that list, by the way, to earn the £400, or any level 3 program which has at least 360 guided learning hours a year, and that includes T levels. And you can see again, engineering, manufacturing, transport, building construction, and ICT for practitioners. So this is all now being, reflected in your planning for next year. The level 3 program for maths and English payment, That's an additional £750 per subject if they're studying a 2-year program. Remember, per subject. We wouldn't expect a lot of level 3 learners doing A-levels or level 3 vocational technical programs or T-levels to be needed to do both. We'd assume they'd already got a grade 4 to 9. And if they're doing it only a 1-year program, but remember, it must be on a level 3 program, it's not level 2s, it's a single payment of £375 per subject. Again, qualifying conditions, 2 qualifying A-levels, or enrolled on a study program including 1 level 3 qualification with at least 360 guided learning hours, or a T-level. Now, obviously, this is going to be affected if we have these alternative assessment arrangements for example, assessment of English and Maths GCSE in schools and colleges this year. Most of the other elements don't change. The large program uplift, which affects some of you, not many of us. The condition of funding will, of course, be using the rates that applied in 18-19, but the amount that will be taken off you in later years will reflect the increase in funding. Remember, funding's going up by 4.7%. The disadvantage block 2 will still remain the same in the next year at £480. But of course, how many learners will qualify for that will, of course, be affected by the prior attainment in English and Maths in the current year. And of course, the funding rates for 14 to 16, they'll stay aligned with what's happening with 16 to 19. So other elements of the formula have not changed. Now, as soon as you start seeing those elements, you think, well, wait a minute, things are not the same. This was all steady state, and we'd planned our study programs for 2020-21 on the basis of what we knew around Christmas time, was confirmed in our allocations in January and February, and in some cases, March. But I think the ESFA has recognized that if we're going to use 2019-20 academic year data to calculate your allocation for 2021 to 22 through the lag number effect, then and also the fact that some of those we can only use some elements. We'll use data that's more than that's a year old. And not based on the current year, then we're going to have to use a different approach. And in some cases, that means using other basic data, which might be the 1920 data, as far as possible, so that we're trying to minimize the ESFA is trying to minimize the impact on funding in 21-22. So I think with that in mind, what they've done is they've picked certain elements, and the COVID-19 effect on these is now being looked at. Not all of these will be answered for you. I mean, if we're thinking about we're thinking about 2020 to 21, I think much of that will stay unchanged, because obviously that was based on data that related to 18-19 full year data. So that's gone out the way. This is much more important for 21-22 and obviously beyond. So the retention factor is one that could already be reflected in people that haven't completed the programs, either because they've just got fed up, they don't want to continue, they don't want to stay on doing distance learning or open learning, or that some learners have just lost the interest, they've withdrawn, or others have just simply not been able because of ill health or whatever. So what the ESFA is going to do is look at the data and see what the impacts are on student withdrawals and retention, and then obviously could then say, well, we can't use data for 2021, for 2019 to 20, because that's not going to be fair in terms of determining your 21-22 allocation. We might have to use full year data or other proxies for it. For us, that isn't such a big issue. Our retention's been quite good, well, so far. For us, a more significant issue has been in-year recruitment, because across all three of the institutions I'm involved in, we recruit learners all the way through the year. So we would have had an Easter recruitment, and we would have usually in the beginning of June another recruitment. We often have recruitment at the end of June, as soon as the learners know they can leave school, so that those learners would be engaged with programs that would in some cases run into the following year. Now, in the past, what we've done is we've said, right, whenever we adjust our numbers, we adjust them for the September, October intake, and then throughout the year, and then we say, well, that gives us, instead of the 100% of the September figures, the first return we make in RO4, we'd have to make that 106% of RO4, because over the course of the year we recruit more learners. Now, I know that doesn't apply to some of you where most of the recruitment is done in September, October. Now, obviously we can't do that because we haven't had a concerted Easter enrollment, and we haven't had a sort of Whitsun enrollment either. So that's impacted on us immediately. The other thing to note there is, therefore, they might have to use the full year data for 18-19, which might be okay for us. In some cases, it might not reflect what we were planning to do. The prior attainment in GCSE English and Maths, as you know, that's used for 3 elements. The condition of funding element, what did you get in the past? If you're not doing a resit or you're not doing the appropriate qualification, we lose a proportion of funding of that group of learners outside we lose 50% of the funding for those learners outside the total value required for the condition. In other words, the tolerance, which is anything more than 5%. So that could have an impact there. It also impacts on block 2, disadvantage funding. Remember, that's the additional funding on a study program of £480 for English, £480 for Maths, for any learner that hasn't already attained English and Maths GCSE at grade 4 to 9. Well, what is it going to be? And the same for the English and Maths payment. So we're going to, the basis for this is going to be the alternative plans to award grades, but this is going to be subject to review and see if that's any different from the past. So in other words, taking account of any changes in population and reflecting what might be the raw scores or the final outcomes, and to see if that needs to be reviewed. So if, for example, the alternative plans to award grades for GCSE English and Maths produce much better grades, then you might end up with a lower disadvantaged block 2 funding, just based on the fact that that alternative has produced that difference. Now, obviously, the review will try to moderate that and make sure that there are any significant switches and changes. I think for me, the 2 other areas where COVID-19 is definitely impacting is anyone that's preparing for in the delivery of T-levels. Now, can I just ask from a show of hands, how many of you were planning to deliver T-levels this year? How many were going to deliver T-levels from this year? A couple of hands going up.
Yeah, so feel free to use the show hands icon, or you can leave a little message if you have any commentary in the chat. Thank you.
I think one of you told us we did, but not now. All right, thank you. A couple yet, still at it. Now, I think remember that your allocation for T-levels for 2021 is based on planned numbers. And you know that there's a tolerance built into the first year where if your numbers go below the tolerance, in other words, your actual enrollment is much less than your plan, there will be some kind of there'll be some kind of taking off that funding off you. That funding will be withdrawn. Now, the thing is, because of the lag number effect, I think what we've got to check is that this isn't a disproportionate impact on you. And obviously, because we're trying to finally remove the planned number approach to T-levels and work on, what do you call it, the lag numbers, is that we don't want that to be a significant cost to you in terms of if you don't deliver what you plan to do. And if you don't deliver what you plan to do and you're outside of the tolerance, the cost at which you find that that's going to be impacted on in your lag numbers in future will be not at the band that the learner was in terms of T-levels. They're going to use band 5 for a full-time study program. So that's a much lower level than the T-level that they might have been in, which might have been band 6 or 7. Now that approach is going to be monitored over the early months of 2021 academic year to see what the impacts might be when it comes to your 21-22 funding. But I think that's just something to note for those of you preparing for the delivery. From your your initial plans, have any of you had any significant feedback from the learners who were due to do T levels that might be starting to create some kind of risk about how that actual numbers will compare to your plan numbers? Because I think that's something that you have to factor in and say, well, ooh, that's not going to impact on us straight away, but it will do certainly in terms of 21, 22. But so many things will impact on 21, 22. I mean, I think the great reassurance for those of you who are particularly high dependence on study program funding is that, you know, that 20 to 21 is going to be not a particularly bad year for you compared to, say, your colleagues who are delivering apprenticeships, commercial income, etc. Now, the second area is the CDF funding, Capacity and Delivery Fund for 1920, because obviously you've got to expend that income, you've got to show it, you've got to show what you're doing, you've got to demonstrate that you're trying to engage with employers. Well, that's difficult now. You've got to prepare students for placements. What are you going to get the placements? How are you going to prepare them? You're going to try and make sure that your curriculum is designed to deliver to the standard required. I don't think there's going to be significant penalisation of you if you can't deliver. You have to indicate that you've tried your best in all of those areas. But please make sure that you don't claim the funding through the Industry Placement Capacity and Delivery Fund for activity and then furlough your staff under the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. That would be double funding and would be picked up quite quickly by audit, although there's not going to be any audit during this current crisis, neither will there be inspection. So those are some of the elements. So if I just go back, those are the things which are directly being affected by COVID, which are impacting on your funding for 21 to 22. The impacts on funding for 20 to 21 are less so because, remember, we were using data for 18-19. And in some cases, obviously, the 1920 data would have been reflected in your enrollments around September, October. The other area of study programs is traineeships for 16, 17, and 18-year-olds. Now, these have had to have some flexibilities introduced. I know for many of our 16 to 18-year-olds, we run up to 200 traineeships just for 16, 17, and 18-year-olds. We would have normally had a 6-month program with a large element of work placement. In some cases, well over half of their hours would have been, study program hours would have been on a placement. Well, it's very difficult to do that with social distancing measures where some of our employers have furloughed all their staff. Some of our employers have gone out of business. So three flexibilities have been introduced for those, and these relate also to adults. The minimum work placement duration is reduced to 70 hours. And that can now be done over 12 months. That might also help you to achieve the English and Maths qualification if you might need longer, but that means 12 months. Now, some of our traineeships were recruited in January and February. They're now going to be continuing into the next academic year right through to December. So that's going to help us a lot. Also, because many of them were on part-time hours, we're going to have to extend their hours. And I know that some of you will say, well, you shouldn't change the planned hours, but we're going to have to because of the number of hours that needed to re-engage them, given the long breaks in learning. So those three things are flexibilities that only introduced as COVID, if you want, exceptions. But we've got to keep evidence of the alternative range of activities that we're providing to our trainees. And many of our trainees, don't forget, would have been progressing on to an apprenticeship. And obviously that's no longer there as an outcome for some of them. And I think we expect to see quite a lot of our trainees coming back onto full-time study programs in the next year. So that's something. Any questions on the trainees' flexibilities? Any questions on that? So you're not running traineeships. Okay, thank you. Now, so remember, even though we're looking at the study programs for 20 to 21 and beyond, 21 to 22, And that's quite critical, especially when we're planning for all these 2-year programs. The conditions of funding still apply. It's how they're going to be applied given the COVID situation. So the eligibility of learners and programs still there. It's a condition of your funding. The English and Maths condition will have to reflect what's happening in terms of the way the English and Maths are being assessed. It's the same issue with the level 3 programs that we talked about. The disadvantaged block 2 funding will also, of course, be impacted. And that's another aspect which will be impacted by the way we assess English and Maths at GCSE. The large program uplift, well, that's obviously the data that we're collecting from the awarding bodies on the number of people that pass A-levels historically. And of course, that could be impacted on by the new way in which, the alternative ways in which A-levels were going to be assessed. The retention factor I've already talked about, needs to be looked at very carefully. Now, all of these conditions might be reflected in questions that auditors will ask. But I am assuming that because the ESFA has given us these flexibilities, because it's introduced these to some extent will not be issues for you unless you've not followed the requirements and not followed the guidance correctly. So I don't see major issues with this. I think collecting evidence of alternative ways of delivering programs is just good practice, not just for audit, but for teaching and learning. So that you can see the sources of data that we were using for 2021, you can see straight away that the lagged student effect number, we're already starting to see the implications with what's happening in R06 or over the course of the year. We talked about that. The match data for large program uplift will still be using 17-18 data. And then for 21-22, we'll be using 18 to 19 data. So that shouldn't be such a problem. It will be a problem when it comes to obviously the some of the other factors that we're looking at. Local authority data will be obviously impacting on high needs. And then we've got the program size, funding factors, condition of funding, industry placement. We've already talked about how those are going to be impacted on for 21-22, not for 2021, because we're using obviously whole year data that and outturn data for 2018-2019. For T levels, it's still going to be a mixture of provider plans because you're all planning numbers, as well as obviously the historical data that we'll collect. And that's going to then obviously be ultimately only lagged number effect, lagged numbers. So I think this raises then quite a lot of questions. Even before COVID, I was already asking these questions. With the changes announced for 2021, you were already asking questions about, well, is it enough for the expectations, the additional expectations, the new inspection framework, the requirement of T levels? We know that there have been cuts in real terms funding. 4.7 doesn't fill that gap. We're now looking at a labour market that could be radically different for next year. Where are we going to have NEETs? Will be a condition of funding. You get all the NEETs into some kind of structured learning. What's going to happen in terms of employment opportunities? Will there be a big, I think there's going to be a significant fall in the number of 16, 17, 18-year-old apprentices because there just simply won't be the jobs and the take on of those jobs. Innovation, interestingly enough, has been given a major boost by the way that we've had to reorganize teaching and learning during the lockdown. And, you know, some of us have been going on for 20 years about why are we not doing more online learning, more blended learning with our 16, 17 and 18-year-olds, particularly with our level 3s. Suddenly this boost to innovation has been quite significant. And I think that is something that will be maintained. I think the quality of the curriculum in terms of Ofsted expectations, well, we'll see what happens because there's going to be quite a lot of things that have to be taken account of. And just simply that the English and Maths condition is still there no matter what, no matter how it's relaxed and no matter how we assess. So with those drivers in mind, I think that this has got big implications for the way that we plan and deliver. It's just the rest of this term. What do we do between now and June and the end of July? Will we need to extend this year's academic? I know that some, as a training provider, we're already talking about saying, well, we're going to have to carry on right till the end of June. It's going to be later assessments for some of the license to practice, just simply because of the volumes and the time. And are we going to have to start study? I've been talking to a T-level provider, says, well, rather than wait till September, we might have to start in the middle of August. Why? Well, because we're going to have to fit everything in, but also because will there be the same requirement for such, well, for example, summer holidays be as long? Might we have to have a break that's anticipated maybe in autumn or winter, where we might have to close down for a month or 6 weeks if there's any reoccurrence? So these are other issues even to be considered for this remainder of this academic year. For next year, the first question we've all asked is, are the increases in the rates of funding through the basic rate of funding, through the cost weightings, enough to cover the cost of delivering some of these programs, including T-levels? If we're offering a much broader range of programs and trying to do so, will any of this be skewed by the increased funding for high cost and high value programs? In other words, could we be inadvertently, through advice and guidance, directing learners into engineering, construction, etc.? But why? Because those programs bring us more revenue, and therefore there could be restrictions on student choice. I think T-levels in terms of viability of class size and contribution rates is just simply not being considered enough in enough detail. We're not doing T-levels for another year anyway. And I think that's something that would be worth looking at by all of us. I think the other big issue for us, and I'm talking here as a college governor, is that we have a large number of learners on study programs, not at level 3, but at level 2. And very little of this is impacting on them other than the base rate funding for those learners. We're not getting the level 3 uplift for high value subjects. We're not getting it for the level 3 maths funding. So that starts to create problems for our existing cohorts, who many of whom wanted a 1-year program before they progressed an apprenticeship. Now we might have to think about them coming back for 2 years after they finished the level 2 program. Is that too long? Will that retain them? If we're using the new technology, might we compound or compact a 3-year program into 2 years? These are key questions I think we're all having to play with now as we anticipate 2021. And of course, one of the big things is there enough in this for the consideration of those learners with special education needs? So, and I think, sitting in all of this is, besides the impacts on students with special education needs and the left behind learners, there's also what's going to happen. Are we going to have enough funding for discretionary learner support if we have much longer programs and different types of programs? But 2, I think, fundamental questions come through. The first of these is quite immediate. If we suddenly find that in September, October, the anticipated growth in 16 to 19 learners is exceeded significantly because there aren't the opportunities for those learners in apprenticeships, employment, or alternative forms of provision, or simply because some of the providers have gone out of business. How are we going to manage when the lag number impact we don't get the money till next year? Will there have to be exceptional support and we'll have to make business cases in the current year, that's in 2021, post-August, to deal with these expected numbers of learners? And what does it mean for our infrastructure, our support systems, etc.? I think that's one that I think many of you are already considering. There's a second issue, which, thanks Gordon has reminded me of course, is the whole of the, if you want, the structure of the post-16 provision is under some view. Are we going to have to rethink those organizational structures, colleges, mergers, what might be in the white paper for FE? These have all got important impacts on your planning for 2020, 21 and beyond. So I think there's a whole lot of factors there that are creeping in. But for us, if there is a significant fall, and I mean, it works both ways, because, for example, as in the college setting, you might find, okay, next year we anticipated 400 16 to 18 apprentices. They're not going to start now. They're going to have to move over onto our study program. Our study program funding was based on lag numbers the numbers we had last September, October. We've now got 400 extra or 300 extra. That's an extra, you need somewhere between, 2 million and a bit. But we're not going to get that until 21, 22. We need it now because that's going to create quite significant delivery issues. And I know some of you have already said that's what you're already anxious about. So the Independent Commission on the College of the Future could have a big impact also on the organizational systems and structures. We might not be talking about so many colleges or training providers next year. And so I think there are some key questions for all of us as study program providers to think about. First question I've already raised is, just without any other changes, was the increased funding from those different sources enough to compensate for the fact that one or two of you were already expecting your numbers through the lag number effect to actually fall? So there you are. That's the one conundrum you've got. Those of you who get it spot on, you're okay. And those of you that suddenly find all these learners that you didn't expect coming along, if it's not reflected in immediate funding or at least some kind of special funding or exceptional funding, you have to wait a year with an increased set of costs but no revenue coming in. And I think we've also got other things which are looming financially, and that is that we've predicated everything, and certainly we have, on increased pension contributions in 2021 being there. But what happens after 21? If that flow of funding is not available to you as a provider, particularly college providers, then you're going to have to find that from somewhere else, and that it will eat up. I mean, I think the lag number effect and the study and the pension thing could eat up all of our increased funding that's through those other sources. And for me, I think all of this could change. The whole of study programs with COVID-19 and its impacts on the widest society, the way that people behave and the way that we associate, the way that people learn, and obviously on the economy. And that might mean restructuring the way we do study programs. I know I was talking to a provider which is already thinking in not investing in any more of its estate. In fact, maybe removing some of its estate and doing a lot more investing in IT equipment, making it available readily to its learners, including those that have not got access to it at home, but also in developing brand new programs which are more flexible in the delivery. So this could be quite significant changes, particularly at level 3. I think the other thing is, well, how are we going to resolve the issue if this goes on beyond summer? And what we'll need is maybe to re-engineer quite a lot of our delivery. And I know that some of you are already doing it in terms of bringing back vulnerable learners and those that have been most disadvantaged over the next few weeks and months. I think also the loss of and I mean that's a good question you've posed. By the question that's been posed to us is, with the loss of the level 2 framework in business admin, which obviously a lot of 16, 17-year-olds had, and of course the jobs are not available, what are we going to have to fill the gap? I mean, generally I think that traineeships can fill the gap, but again, you might have to choose an alternative program in terms of either at level 1 or level 2 for what they call the flexible element. It's going to be difficult to get the work placements, I agree. And that means that we might have to think about, well, if we can't do that, will the ESFA flex its rules on things like simulation, on internal work placements, and alternative models of work-based learning, which I think has got to be taken account of. We know that the decision's already been made to delay. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked for business level 2 to delay the transition from frameworks to standards. I think that's a good decision because we just haven't got the energy or time and the appropriate alternatives yet because of the delay in working on that. But if anyone's got any advice on what would be a good alternative offer for your traditional 16, 17-year-old that wants to do a level 2 framework in business admin, please get back to us and then I'll pass them on to, is it Ben Kingsland? I'm not quite sure. Is it Ben? If Ben could just, is that, I might be doing it a disservice. You might have, you might be, oh, Brainy, sorry, Brainy. But Brainy, if we can get any, I'll ask people to come back to me on that one and then pass it on to you. I mean, we obviously have been running traineeship programs where the learners do some business, but we're tending to choose progression qualifications and smaller qualifications to do it, not the full level 2. Our problem is going to be finding the placements and the what do you call it, the progression to apprenticeships in that area, when there's going to be a lack of jobs definitely in that area. So we might be moving to an alternative provision, but certainly I'll root something out for you from another from one of the awarding bodies. Thank you for that, Brianne. So those are the sort of key questions I think that we're posing at this stage. Please get in touch with us if you want to know more about the other webinars that we offer and our other services. There are details there. Or if you want me to have a look at what you're proposing for 2021 in the light of what's happened in the last 8 weeks or so. But my big concern is that in the current, just focusing on study programs to the completion of study programs this year, is that we've lost so much learning time with so many of our first year learners that are on 2-year programs. We've managed to cope obviously with the second years, but we've also had this issue about those that we are concerned about have been left behind for all kinds of reasons, and we just haven't been able to meet their needs up to now, but we will do. Because a lot of them are requesting face-to-face learning. So we'll have to re-engineer our offer. For 2021, those of us are grant funded and have got contracts and subcontracts with grant funded organizations. We're okay as long as things do return to some kind of normality. If we then suddenly find they're not, or if we find they're not, then there's going to have to be quite different arrangements. My big concern is how this all could impact on 21-22. And can we be assured that all these factors will work in the way that we're expecting them to work up to now? Any more questions, Marek? Just started to lose my voice there.
I could tell those allergies are kicking in, Beej.
Yeah.
No, I can't see any more questions that we've or anything that we've missed, but really good questions that we took there, or on thoughts that we shared as well. So thank you very much, and thanks a lot there, Beej, as well.
If we just close down the recording then. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Marek. We'll close down the recording now.
Again, I'll just address this to anybody else who's watching this on the recording. If you have any questions or thoughts, there are the contact details. Please feel free to get in touch.